At Thanksgiving, my family mocked my cramped apartment and my thrift store coat. They pointed at me like a cautionary tale, a life wasted on small living. Then my private banker called about the account. They pounced, sure it proved the broke old woman was finally out of money. But what the banker confirmed, on speaker, was the secret I'd kept for 40 years. Living small let me quietly build a fortune, and every relative who laughed just learned whose generosity they were counting on. Pearl had spent 40 years being the family's cautionary tale, the widow who never remarried, never traveled, never bought anything new. At every holiday, her relatives whispered that she was fragile, broke, fading. They had no idea that while they pitied her, she was quietly building something that would outlast their mockery. The central question isn't how she hid the money, it's why she chose to look poor when she could have had everything. And what finally forced her to reveal the truth after 4 decades of silence. To understand that, you have to go back to the day her world collapsed, and the secret was born. The collapse came on a Tuesday in March of 1979. Pearl was 28 years old, married to a man named Henry who talked about starting a scholarship foundation the way other men talked about buying a bigger house. Henry was a high school teacher who saw bright kids drop out because their families couldn't afford college. He'd say, "One day, we'll fix that." He died of an aneurysm in the middle of his 5th period history class, a piece of chalk still between his fingers. After the funeral, Pearl sat alone in their small house, surrounded by condolence casseroles and the silence of a life cut short. She found his teaching bag, still packed for the day he never finished. Inside was a folder labeled Dream Fund, handwritten applications from students he'd been quietly helping with money from his own pocket. $50 here, 100 there, always anonymous. Pearl read every letter. They all said the same thing: I didn't think anyone believed in me. She made a decision that night. She would finish what Henry started, but on a scale no one would see coming. She sold the house within 6 months and moved into a studio apartment above a dry cleaner. Every dollar from the sale went into a brokerage account she opened under the foundation's name, the Henry Alden Memorial Scholarship. She took a job as a library assistant, worked 6 days a week, and lived on less than half her income. The rest went straight into the fund. Her wardrobe came from church rummage sales. Her furniture was what neighbors left on the curb. Her family, her sister, her cousins, her in-laws watched with growing horror. At first, they offered sympathy, then concern, then scorn. They started calling her Poor Pearl behind her back, and eventually to her face. They said she was letting grief turn her into a recluse, that she was too proud to accept help. She never corrected them. She just kept depositing. But while they pitied her, the account was compounding. She'd invested early in things most people ignored: index funds when they were new, a tech company that made sharing photos online, a coffee chain that was just 4 stores when she first bought in. She didn't chase trends. She just held. And held. Every quarter, the statements showed a number that would have shocked anyone who saw it. But no one did. She kept the mail delivered to a P.O. box and never spoke of it. The only person who knew was a young banker at First Mercantile named Arthur Cho, who'd started as a teller and rose to private wealth manager alongside her portfolio. He called her the miracle account internally. Pearl called it Henry's legacy. By the time her nieces and nephews were teenagers, the fund was worth over $2 million. That's when Pearl began making the first anonymous scholarship awards in Henry's name. She targeted exactly the kind of students Henry had helped. Kids from struggling families. Kids who just needed one person to say yes. Hundreds of them. Thousands over the years. And here's the part her relatives never knew. 3 of them were their own children. Pearl's niece, the one whose mother always mocked Pearl's thrift store blouses, had her entire nursing degree funded by the Henry Alden Memorial. Pearl's cousin's son, who cracked jokes about her tiny little box of an apartment, got a full ride for his engineering program. And the nephew who once said at a family barbecue that Aunt Pearl probably saves her toenail clippings had his graduate studies paid for without ever suspecting the source. She never told them. She just sent the checks, signed the award letters with a foundation officer's name, and kept wearing her same worn coat to family gatherings. The family, of course, remained oblivious. Every holiday, they'd gather at someone's nice house, her sister's 4-bedroom colonial, or her cousin's renovated farmhouse, and Pearl would arrive alone, carrying a discount store pie. They'd look at her thin coat and her scuffed shoes and exchange glances. Someone would always say, "Bless her heart." They thought she was a charity case they were kind enough to include. In reality, she was the family's most significant benefactor, and she was watching them cash checks she'd written without ever saying thank you. But Pearl didn't do it for gratitude. She did it because Henry had taught her that dignity comes from what you give without recognition. And because she knew that one day, the truth would surface on its own. That day was set to be Thanksgiving of this year. Pearl was 72 now, still in the same studio apartment, still wearing the same thrift store coat. The scholarship fund had grown to over $8 million, and Arthur Cho had been urging her for years to consider what would happen to the foundation after her death. She'd finally agreed to update the paperwork, to name a successor trustee, to have the account properly reviewed. Arthur had scheduled a call for that afternoon, a call that would finalize the transfer of authority and, in some form, end her 40-year secret. Pearl hadn't planned for it to happen during dinner. But these things have a way of timing themselves. As she set the table with mismatched plates and heard the first car pull up outside, she slipped her phone into her pocket, just in case. She didn't know that by the time pumpkin pie was served, her entire family would know exactly who had been paying for their children's futures, and they would have to face the fact that the woman they'd mocked for a lifetime was the only reason their kids had a chance. The front door swung open, her sister's voice rang out with fake cheerfulness, and the phone in Pearl's pocket started to vibrate with Arthur Cho's name on the screen. The door swung open, and her sister Margaret swept in first, arms open wide, voice pitched loud enough for the whole building to hear. "Pearl, sweetheart, you poor thing, still in this place. I swear I hold my breath every time I climb those stairs." She kissed the air near Pearl's cheek, leaving a smear of lipstick that Pearl would find later. Behind Margaret came her husband Don, who always looked mildly embarrassed to exist, and their son Tyler, 23, who hadn't looked Pearl in the eye since he was 15. Then the cousins, Janice, who had once described Pearl's apartment as a walk-in closet with ambition, and her daughter Chloe, who was working on her master's in psychology and already spoke about Pearl in diagnostic terms. Finally, the nephew Kevin, 31, with his new wife Dana, who had never met Pearl before and was being primed for a family joke. They filed into the apartment, and the performance began immediately. Kevin scanned the single room, kitchenette against one wall, love seat, bookshelf, twin bed visible through an open door, and let out a low whistle. "Wow, Aunt Pearl, you've really curated a lifestyle." Dana's eyes went wide, not with wonder, but with alarm. Janice stepped in with the rescue. "It's fine, sweetie, we're all here to celebrate no matter the square footage." She patted Pearl's arm as if consoling a terminal patient. Pearl smiled, the same gentle smile she'd worn for 40 years, and gestured to the table she had pulled out from under the window and covered with a hand-stitched cloth. "I'm glad you all came," she said. And she meant it. She had invited them, knowing exactly what they'd say and how they'd say it, because she wanted them to witness what was about to happen. The meal started with the usual choreography. Margaret complimented the potatoes with a tone that suggested she was being charitable. Don asked about the building's heating system to fill silence. Tyler stared at his phone. And then the conversation, as it always did, turned toward the family's favorite topic, Pearl's lack of ambition. It began softly, like a tide coming in. Janice mentioned a new retirement community that was really affordable for seniors on fixed incomes. Kevin said he'd read an article about holistic decluttering and thought Pearl could be sort of a role model for unattachment. They laughed, except Dana, who looked uncomfortably around the tiny room, and Chloe, who was studying Pearl's face with clinical curiosity. Aunt Pearl, Chloe said suddenly, do you ever feel isolated? It might help to talk through your choices with someone. Pearl folded her napkin. I'm not alone, she said. I have my work, my reading, my... Your what? Margaret interrupted. Pearl, you work in a library basement archiving newspapers no one reads. You wear a coat that was out of style when I was in high school. I don't say this to hurt you, but if something happened to you tomorrow, what would we even have to work with? We'd be the ones handling your affairs, and it would be chaos. No will, no assets, probably just a pile of overdue notices. The words landed like pebbles in still water. Pearl's expression didn't change. She had heard versions of this for decades. But then Kevin, emboldened by his mother's tone, leaned forward and delivered the point they were all dancing around. We were talking on the way over about what happens after. To your estate, if you can call it that. Which of us should handle things? I mean, it's not a big job, obviously, but someone has to sort through the... He gestured around, unable to find a kind word, the everything. Before Pearl could answer, the phone in her pocket buzzed once, twice, then went silent. She felt it like a small heartbeat against her hip. Arthur Cho. She'd told him to call at 4:30, and it was 4:30. The timing could not have been more perfect. She let it ring. Margaret noticed her hand moving toward her pocket. Who's calling you on Thanksgiving? She asked, eyes narrowing. A collector? Or are you screening your doctor again? A friend, Pearl said. I'll call them back. Nonsense. Janice reached across the table and plucked the phone from Pearl's cardigan before she could react. Let's see who still checks on our Pearl. She squinted at the screen, misreading the name. Arthur Cho. Sounds fancy. Let's put him on speaker, see what he wants. It's a holiday, maybe he's bringing you a plate. Janice, don't, Pearl said, but the button was pressed, and the room filled with the crisp voice of a man who had managed private wealth for 40 years. Mrs. Alden? Arthur Cho here. Sorry to call on a holiday, but you asked me to confirm once the paperwork was finalized. I'm happy to report that the transfer of authority is complete. The account is secure, and the Foundation's current liquid assets sit at $8.4 million. I've also dispatched the scholarship disbursements for the spring semester as you instructed, including the renewal for Chloe Mallory. Congratulations to your niece, by the way. And the final payment for Tyler Simpson's engineering degree. Kevin's graduate funding is also fully allocated for next term. Everything is in order. The phone sat on the table like a live grenade. For 3 seconds, no one breathed. Tyler's phone clattered out of his hand. Chloe's clinical expression collapsed into something raw and unreadable. Kevin's face drained of color. Margaret opened her mouth and closed it twice. Janice, still holding the phone, stared at the screen as if it had just bitten her. Dana, the only one with no skin in the family mockery yet, whispered, "What is happening?" Pearl leaned forward and gently took the phone. Thank you, Arthur. I'll review the statements tomorrow. Happy Thanksgiving. She ended the call and set the device face down beside her plate. The silence that followed was the loudest sound that tiny apartment had ever held. Then Margaret exploded. $8 million? You have $8 million, and you live like a shut-in, and you let all of us, worry about you for 40 years? I lent you $50 last Christmas, Pearl. You said you needed it for a heating bill. I did need it, Pearl said quietly. My heating bill was $62. I put the 50 toward it and covered the rest. I never asked for your concern, Margaret. You offered it. She looked around the table. at the faces now contorted with shock, betrayal, and a dawning, terrible confusion. Every one of you believed I was destitute. I let you believe it because it kept the scholarship fund safe from people who might want to repurpose it. Kevin stood up so fast his chair scraped the floor. You funded my graduate degree? I used that scholarship to pay for my housing. I took the award letter at face value. I never even thought, how could you not tell me? Would you have taken it if you knew it came from me? Pearl asked, her voice utterly calm. When you were 14, you told me at a family reunion that I was creepy for reusing tea bags. When you graduated high school, you said you hoped you never ended up trapped in a box like Aunt Pearl. Would you have accepted $1 from a woman you pitied that much? Kevin had no answer. He sat back down, hands limp. Chloe was crying now, silent tears that she couldn't seem to stop. I'm studying psychology because of my scholarship, she said. I told my advisor I wanted to understand people like, she couldn't finish. People like you, the room heard anyway. Pearl nodded. I read your essays. You want to help those who struggle with agency. I hope you will. You're very smart, Chloe. You just never learn to see the agency in someone who chooses differently than you do. Margaret found her voice again, sharper this time. This is monstrous, Pearl. You've been judging us all our lives, hoarding this secret, watching us flatter you with pity while you held the checkbook. You could have helped us. Not just the kids, but us. We struggled. We had mortgages, medical bills. Don's company laid him off. You could have eased our burden. And you just watched us drown. Drown? Pearl tilted her head. Don landed a new job within 5 weeks. Your mortgage is 5% of the home's original value because you refinanced 4 times. You've taken vacations to Florida every winter for the last 8 years. You are not drowning, Margaret. You were just never satisfied with swimming. She paused, and then delivered the line that twisted the knife. And you never once asked me what I was doing with my life. You only asked what I wasn't spending. The room shifted. The accusations began to fracture. Tyler, still processing, blurted out, but why the act? Why not just live like a normal rich person and still give us money? Why the coat, the apartment, all of it? Pearl picked up her thrift store coat from the back of her chair and held it in her lap. Because this coat cost $3, and it's seen me through 12 winters. Because Henry taught me that wealth isn't for display, it's for impact. He died with nothing to his name but a folder full of letters from kids he'd helped. I decided that my whole life would be an extension of that folder. And I decided that the only way to protect it was to make myself invisible. If I lived large, the family would ask for loans. They'd want positions on the board. They'd want to rebrand the foundation in the family name. I've seen it happen to other benefactors. So I chose small. I chose to disappear. Dana, the newcomer, spoke up with a shaking voice. But you invited us here today. You knew the call would come. You wanted us to find out like this. Pearl met her eyes. Yes, because I'm 72. Arthur Cho is retiring. The foundation needed a public face, and I can't be invisible anymore. But I also wanted you to understand, before I named a successor, what you were all actually inheriting. Not money. A mission. A responsibility. And I wanted to see if any of you could apologize to me before you realized I was useful to you. She looked at Kevin, at Chloe, at Tyler. No one did. That was when Kevin's wife, Dana, did something no one expected. She stood, walked around the table, and knelt beside Pearl's chair. I didn't know you before this afternoon, she said. But my husband has talked about you for years as a punchline. And I just watched you hold the entire foundation of this family in your hand and never once raise your voice. I want to apologize for him. He was wrong. They were all wrong. Kevin looked betrayed anew. Dana, no, she said. She paid for your future, Kevin. She paid for your cousin's futures. And all she got in return was mockery at Christmas. I'm ashamed of you. I'm ashamed for us. Pearl placed a hand on Dana's shoulder. Thank you, she said. Then she looked at the rest of the family, each face a different shade of humiliation, anger, and disbelief. I'm going to ask you all to leave now, not because I'm angry, because I need you to sit with what you've just learned before we discuss what comes next. She stood, and for the first time, the room saw her as something other than fragile. But before you go, I'll tell you one more thing. The foundation is being renamed next month. It will no longer be the Henry Alden Memorial. It will be the Pearl Alden Foundation, and I will be the visible public head of it. So the woman in the thrift store coat is about to be on the front page of the city paper. And every article will include the origin story about a family that laughed at the woman who changed their children's lives. The family stood in shock, gathering coats, not looking at each other. As they filed out past the folding table, Margaret paused at the door. You think this makes you righteous, she said. But it just makes you cold. Pearl didn't blink. I've been cold in this apartment for 40 winters, so your son could be warm in a classroom. Don't ever confuse temperature with character. She closed the door gently behind them, and the click of the latch was the final note of the first act. But inside the apartment, Pearl leaned against the door and let out a breath she'd been holding since 1979. Tomorrow would bring calls, lawyers, perhaps reconciliation, perhaps warfare. She had no illusions. But tonight, she would heat up leftovers, pour a cup of tea, and open Henry's folder of letters, the one she still kept by her bed. Because the secret was out. But the work was not done. And somewhere in the silence of that tiny apartment, a far bigger question now hung in the air. What would a family built on mockery become when the mockery collapsed, and only the truth remained? That answer would begin to unfold the very next morning, when her phone rang again. The phone rang at 7:30 the next morning. Pearl was already dressed, tea in hand, watching the gray November light fill her single window. She answered on the second ring, expecting Margaret's fury or perhaps a lawyer. Instead, a voice she didn't recognize introduced himself as Greg Marsh from the City Register. Mrs. Alden, we've received a press release from First Mercantile announcing the renaming of your foundation and some rather astonishing figures. I'd like to talk to you for a story. The woman in the thrift store coat who built an $8 million scholarship empire. It's a hell of a headline. Pearl paused, felt the weight of 40 years of silence lifting, and said, I'll give you 15 minutes. The article appeared online before noon, then in the Saturday print edition. The headline read, The Secret Philanthropist of Orchard Street, How a Widow in a Studio Apartment Sent Hundreds to College. It detailed the scholarship fund, the early investments, the anonymous awards. It quoted Pearl, I lived small, so others could live large. It didn't mention the family by name, but it didn't have to. The story had already been told in living rooms and Facebook threads across the county by nightfall. Someone, Dana, Pearl suspected, had shared the Thanksgiving confrontation on a community group, and the digital wildfire had begun. By Sunday evening, the family had become a local spectacle. The calls began Saturday. Margaret left 4 voicemails, her voice oscillating between tears and fury. You made us look like fools, Pearl. Fools and villains. That reporter called me for comment. I had to say we were always supportive, that we always admired you. I lied through my teeth to protect us, and I hated every second. Janice sent an email that read, The kids are being harassed at school because of you. Chloe's advisor asked her about the aunt in the article. I hope your victory lap was worth it. Tyler texted once, I didn't ask for this. Kevin didn't call at all that first day. He was too busy with damage control. But the real escalation came on Monday morning. Arthur Cho arrived at Pearl's apartment with a thick folder and a troubled expression. There's something we need to discuss before the board meeting next week. Something that goes beyond the family embarrassment. He spread documents across the folding table, the same table where the family had assembled for their mockery. We've been auditing the disbursements from the last 4 years. All the family scholarship renewals are in order, but there's an irregularity in one of the file submissions. Kevin Alden Simmons's most recent renewal application listed his parents' household income at $38,000. That qualified him for the maximum grant. Arthur tapped a page. According to tax records, his actual household income, combining Janice's salary, her husband's consulting fees, and rental income from 2 properties, is $112,000. Kevin misrepresented his finances, not by a little, by nearly triple. Pearl sat down slowly. Kevin had applied for the scholarship without knowing its source. He'd lied to the foundation, thinking it was a faceless committee. But the fraud was still fraud, and now it was attached to a publicly named entity with her signature on every award letter. How much did he receive over what he was actually eligible for? Pearl asked. About $62,000 over 3 years, Arthur said. If this becomes public, it could not only claw back the funds, but also damage the foundation's integrity with donors. And given the family's current media exposure, I'd say it's only a matter of time before a reporter digs into the full story. That was the wait. It gets worse moment. It wasn't just that the family had mocked her. They'd now been caught systematically misusing the very system that paid for their children. And Kevin had done it while his mother was the loudest voice at every Thanksgiving, calling Pearl a warning and a charity case. The irony was a weapon. Pearl called Kevin personally. She didn't leave a voicemail. She kept calling until he answered. Kevin, you and I need to talk, not over text, face to face. Bring Dana. He arrived 2 hours later, Dana's hand in his, both of them looking like they hadn't slept. They sat on the thrift store love seat while Pearl placed the financial documents in front of them. Explain this. Kevin read in silence, his face cycling through confusion, denial, then a sick realization. I didn't think it mattered. The income guidelines always felt arbitrary. Mom and Dad were stretched thin. We had debts. I just fudged the numbers so I could get through without loans. I never meant to steal from anyone. Dana looked away, jaw tight. You told me your parents were practically broke. You told me the scholarship was a lifeline. You let me pity your aunt while you were cashing checks she signed. Kevin couldn't answer. Pearl's voice was calm, but cold as stone. The foundation operates on trust. Every dollar we award is a promise to a student who actually needs it. You took that trust and used it to fund a lifestyle none of us could afford. And you did it while your mother called me a failure. I could refer this to the fraud division. I could demand restitution. But before I decide, I want to know, were you the only one? The question hung. Dana, the only family member who'd offered genuine apology, whispered, I think you should check Chloe's file too. She told me once that her parents had helped her with the application. She said they knew some tricks. Pearl felt the ground of her family collapse further. Chloe, the psychology student who studied lonely old women like specimens, had she been complicit in gaming the system? And Tyler, the silent son, had he known? The foundation's entire family portfolio was now a minefield. What followed over the next 10 days was a forensic unraveling. Arthur Cho's team reviewed every application tied to the Alden family tree. They found that Tyler's awards were legitimate, his parents' income was indeed modest, but that Margaret had filed the paperwork without his knowledge, exaggerating his disability accommodations to qualify for additional grants. She'd gotten an extra $8,000 in adaptive technology funds that Tyler never received. Margaret had pocketed the overage, calling it family reimbursement for years of supporting Tyler's needs. Meanwhile, Chloe's application listed her as an independent student, even though she lived at home and Janice claimed her as a dependent on tax returns that weren't disclosed. That misrepresentation netted her an extra $14,000 in need-based aid. The pattern was undeniable. The family that had ridiculed Pearl for being small was full of people who'd been taking big from the very pockets they'd mocked. And then, the story got even bigger. In mid-December, a retired ethics professor at the university where many of the scholarships had been awarded contacted the foundation with a letter he'd found in his late wife's files. The professor's wife had served on the scholarship committee in the early 2000s, before the foundation was public. The letter was from Janice Alden, dated May 2003. It requested that the committee prioritize applicants with ties to the Alden family and offered a recurring administrative donation to the committee's discretionary fund in exchange for preferential review. The letter had been filed away without action, but it proved that Janice had tried to leverage the foundation's anonymity for insider access years before the secret came out. She had been fishing for family favors while Pearl was still unknown. Pearl held that letter in her hands and felt something inside her harden permanently. It was one thing for the family to mock her poverty. It was another for them to systematically exploit the charity she'd built. She realized that her secrecy hadn't only protected the foundation from outside requests. It had protected her from seeing just how deeply rooted the family's entitlement ran. And now every new document was a fresh wound. The calls came daily from Margaret, Janice, Kevin, demanding to fix this quietly, to not destroy the family over paperwork. Margaret offered to repay the $8,000 next year. Janice insisted the letter was a misunderstanding, a well-intentioned inquiry. Kevin begged Pearl to consider his imminent graduation, his job offers, his future. But the foundation's board of directors, now informed, had begun an independent review, and the local paper had indeed gotten wind. Greg Marsh published a follow-up story on December 18th. Scholarship scandal unravels, family of secret philanthropist accused of fraud. The article listed the irregularities, the amounts, the false claims. The public reaction was savage. The family's humiliation was now complete and permanent. It was in the midst of this storm that Dana appeared at Pearl's door alone, carrying a manila envelope. Her eyes were red. "I'm leaving Kevin," she said. "I can't stay with someone who lied to everyone, including me. But that's not why I'm here." She handed over the envelope. "I went through our file cabinets. I found this at the bottom of Janice's old financial binder. Kevin must have brought it home to store. I think it's the original foundation ledger from Henry's classroom." Pearl opened the envelope and found a small, leather-bound notebook, 30 years older than any document she'd seen. Inside, in Henry's unmistakable handwriting, were entries dating back to 1978. The Dream Fund, the original student names, the amounts. But the last few pages were not about students. They were notes about the family. Henry had written, "Margaret asked me for a loan today. Told her we had nothing. Janice wants me to co-sign on a car. I can't. Don told me I was wasting my time with these scholarships, that I should think of my own family first. I told him the kids are my family." And finally, an entry dated 2 weeks before he died, "I'm starting to see that our family will never understand this. Pearl is the only one who does. Protect her from them. They'll drain her dry, if they can. This fundraiser, this dream, it depends on invisibility." Pearl read those words, and 40 years of silence made sense in a way it never had before. Henry had known. He'd seen what the family was capable of, and he'd warned her across time. She hadn't just been carrying his dream, she'd been following his silent instruction. The foundation was never meant to be a family business. It was meant to be a refuge from them. The next morning, Pearl called a family meeting. Not at her apartment. That tiny room could no longer contain the weight of what had to be said. She booked a conference room at the public library, the same basement where she'd worked for 40 years archiving newspapers. She invited everyone: Margaret, Dawn, Tyler, Janice, her husband, Chloe, Kevin, even Dana, who is now living with a friend. She also invited Arthur Cho and the foundation's attorney. She told them all, "This is not a discussion. This is a disclosure. You will listen, and then you will decide your own futures." As the family members arrived, one by one, the tension was suffocating. Margaret wouldn't make eye contact. Janice looked thinner, older, Kevin's face was hollow. Tyler sat apart, headphones on until his mother swatted them off. Chloe clutched a notebook like a shield. Pearl stood at the head of the table, wearing the same thrift store coat she'd worn at Thanksgiving, and she began to speak. "I'm going to tell you what I've decided. After that, you'll have one opportunity to ask questions, and then this chapter will close forever. The foundation will not press criminal charges. Not because I'm merciful, but because Henry wouldn't have wanted to see any of you in a courtroom. However, the fraud matters will be settled civilly. Kevin, you will repay the $62,000 over 10 years at 0 interest, directly into a new scholarship fund for students from foster care. Margaret, you will repay the $8,000. Janice, the overages tied to Chloe's application will be deducted from any future family awards. And all of you will be permanently removed from any association with the foundation's governance. No board seats. No naming rights. No input." The table erupted in protests, but Pearl raised a hand. "That's the consequence. Now here's the offer. The foundation will continue to fund current scholarship holders through graduation. That includes Tyler, Chloe, and Kevin. No student will be punished for their parents' actions. But new family applicants will be held to the same blind review standard as every other student in the state. No exceptions. No legacy preference." She paused, letting the air settle. "I am also creating a new family advisory committee, non-financial, purely conversational, to discuss how our family's story might help others. Dana has agreed to chair it. She's the only one who thought to apologize before she knew what I could give her. Anyone who wants to be part of rebuilding our family's integrity is welcome to join. Anyone who doesn't can walk away, and I'll still love you, but I won't protect you from the consequences of your choices." The silence that followed was the longest yet. Then, unexpectedly, Tyler spoke. "I didn't know my mom took that money. But I also didn't say anything when you were the punchline at every dinner. I'll join the committee, if you'll have me." His voice was raw, barely above a whisper. Margaret stared at him, tears falling, but said nothing. What would happen next would define the Alden family for generations. Would they heal, fracture, or rewrite themselves entirely? That answer would come in the month that followed as the foundation's public launch approached, and Pearl stepped onto a stage no one had ever seen her occupy. Margaret said nothing for a long time after Tyler spoke. Her son had just volunteered to sit on a committee chaired by the woman divorcing her nephew, and the weight of that crosswise loyalty seemed to press her into her chair. Then she pushed back from the table and stood, her coat half on, her face tear streaked but hard. "I'll pay back the $8,000, she said, voice rough. "But I won't be on any committee. I won't sit in a circle and talk about integrity while you hold a ledger over our heads." She looked at Pearl, and for the first time in 40 years, the contempt was gone, replaced by something closer to exhaustion. "I don't know how to undo what we said. I don't know if I can. But I'll send the money." She walked out, Dawn trailing behind her. Tyler remained seated. He didn't follow them. Janice's face was the color of old paper. She had been the one who mocked Pearl's coat, who snatched the phone, who had once written a letter trying to rig the scholarship committee. She opened her mouth several times before words came. I didn't think the letter would ever surface. I was desperate, and I was ashamed, and I took that shame out on you for 2 decades. I have no excuse. She turned to Chloe, who was frozen beside her. I lied on your application. It wasn't Chloe's fault. I told her it was standard practice, that everybody optimizes the numbers. She believed me. Chloe's eyes were red raw. I wanted to believe you, she whispered, because if it was standard, then I wasn't a fraud. Then I wasn't living off a lie. She faced Pearl, voice barely a whisper. I'm going to repay my overages out of my first year's salary. Whatever it takes. And I'm going to work with families like ours, families that normalize small deceptions until they're big ones. That's the clinical focus I should have had all along. Kevin signed the repayment agreement that morning, right there in the library basement with Arthur Cho as witness. 10 years, 0 interest, $62,000 into a foster care scholarship fund. His hand was steady when he signed, but his eyes kept drifting to Dana, who sat at the far end of the table, not looking at him. She had returned the manila envelope with Henry's ledger and then taken her seat beside Pearl. She was no longer a daughter-in-law defending a husband she'd just left. She was becoming something else. A bridge, perhaps, between the old family and whatever might grow from the wreckage. The public launch of the Pearl Alden Foundation was set for January 15th, a date Pearl chose deliberately. It would have been Henry's 77th birthday. The venue was the city library's main hall, a grand room with high ceilings and murals of local history, the same building where Pearl had spent 40 years in the basement archiving newspapers. She'd never been in this room except to clean it after hours. Now, she stood at a podium, wearing the same thrift store coat, and faced 300 people, journalists, foundation donors, scholarship recipients past and present, and a section of family members scattered across the second row. Margaret was not there. She'd sent the first repayment check by certified mail and a note that read, "I'm not ready." But Tyler was in the front row, next to Dana. Janice sat at the aisle, holding Chloe's hand so tightly the knuckles were white. Kevin came alone, shoulders hunched but present. And Don, the quiet husband who'd spent years looking embarrassed, had come without Margaret. A small act of rebellion that said more than any speech could. Pearl began her remarks by holding up Henry's leather notebook, the one Dana had found. "This is the original Dream Fund," she said, her voice carrying clear and steady. 46 years ago, my husband wrote down the names of students he believed in. He gave them what little we had, and he asked them to promise one thing, that someday, when they could, they would believe in someone else. She opened the notebook to the last pages, the ones where Henry had warned her about the family. She didn't read those aloud. Instead, she said, "Henry understood something I had to learn for myself. Generosity is not a family business, it is a public trust. The moment it becomes a tool for status or obligation, it stops being generosity and starts being a transaction." She then announced the new structure. The foundation would be governed by an independent board, not a family board. All scholarships would remain need-blind. The Family Advisory Committee would exist, but it would never touch the money. And for the first time, she publicly acknowledged the fraud cases. My own family members took advantage of a system built on anonymity. I am not proud of that. But I am proud that when the truth came out, some of them chose to face it. That is the beginning of integrity. A standing ovation followed, not for the foundation, but for the woman who had lived small for 40 years so that 700 students could earn degrees. Among those who stood was a man near the back, silver-haired, in a well-worn suit. After the ceremony, he approached Pearl with a letter in his hand. His name was Marcus Webb. He was the first student Henry had ever helped, a boy from the wrong side of town who'd needed $50 for a college application fee. Henry gave it to him in March of 1979, 2 weeks before he died. Marcus had gone on to become an engineer, then a tech founder, then a philanthropist in his own right. He had followed the foundation's work for years, unaware that Henry was behind it until the news broke. Now he handed Pearl a check for $1 million, seed money for a new Henry Alden Memorial Science Scholarship. "He believed in me when nobody else did," Marcus said. "I'm just passing it on." Pearl took the check with tears running down her face, the first tears she'd let anyone see since Henry's funeral. The months that followed were a season of small and large reconciliations. Tyler became the quiet anchor of the Family Advisory Committee, working with Dana to create a code of conduct for family interactions with the foundation. He still spoke to his mother on Sundays, but he no longer let her narrative shape his conscience. Chloe graduated with her master's and redirected her clinical focus toward family financial ethics and elder esteem. She wrote Pearl a letter that said, "I spent years studying people like you as if you were a pathology. I realize now I was studying my own fear of a life not measured by accumulation." Kevin began his repayment plan and volunteered as a financial literacy mentor for high school students in low-income neighborhoods. The work changed him. Slowly, he stopped trying to explain away his choices and started living with their weight. Dana became the foundation's community liaison, and her friendship with Pearl deepened into something neither had expected. Pearl had never had a daughter, and Dana had lost her own mother years before. They spent Saturday mornings at the apartment, drinking tea and sorting through scholarship applications, the tiny room now feeling not cramped but full. And Pearl, who had never traveled, accepted an invitation from Marcus Webb to visit the university that would house the new science scholarship. She bought a new coat for the trip, a simple one, still thrift store in spirit, but with a tag that wasn't faded. She called it her headline coat. But the final surprising detail came later that spring, when the Foundation's archivist was digitizing Henry's teaching files and discovered a sealed envelope addressed to Pearl in Henry's handwriting, tucked inside a textbook he'd used in his final year. It was dated the morning of the day he died. The note was short. "Pearl, if today is the day I go, remember, the kids need someone who won't quit. You are that someone. Tell no one what we're building until it can stand on its own. And when it's finally time, step into the light. I'll be watching." He had signed it with a small drawing of a car, the car they'd never take on their retirement road trip, the one that lived only in his dreams. Pearl framed the letter and hung it on the wall of her studio apartment below the window that had seen 40 winters. On the last page of Henry's notebook, there was one more entry Pearl had missed when she first read it. A single line at the very bottom. Written so small, she needed a magnifying glass to read it. It said, "The truest charity is to give without the recipient ever knowing your name. The second truest is to give while they mock you, and let the truth reveal itself in time." Pearl had lived both. And now, at 72, she was no longer invisible. She was, finally, the face of the love her husband had left her to finish. For 40 years, the family had laughed at the woman in the tiny apartment. But after everything that happened, after the apologies and the lawsuits and the slow, hard work of rebuilding, the question no one could stop asking was this: what do you do when you realize the person you pitied was the person who held your entire future in her hands, and did even when you were cruel? That's the question the Alden family is still answering. And it's the one all of us might have to answer someday, when the people we underestimate turn out to be the ones who changed our lives. Because here's what Pearl's 40-year silence really teaches us. Not that money heals everything, but that the stories we tell about people are almost always incomplete. For decades, her family spun a narrative about a fragile, failing woman who'd given up on life. They used her as a punchline, a cautionary tale, a measuring stick for their own success. And all the while, she was quietly stitching together futures they never bothered to see. The most dangerous assumption in any family, in any community, is that you already know who someone is. Pearl was never the disappointment. She was the benefactor. The family just couldn't see it because they were too busy counting her furniture and not her impact. And that's the uncomfortable mirror this story holds up. How many people do we write off because their life doesn't look like ours? The neighbor who never updates her kitchen. The coworker who brings the same lunch every day. The relative who always sits quietly at the edges of the party. We assign them identities based on what we value, wealth, status, visibility, and forget that the things that truly matter are often invisible. Pearl lived small on purpose, not because she lacked ambition, but because her ambition was directed outward. She wanted to build something that would outlast her, and she understood that true giving doesn't demand applause. It demands stealth, patience, and the willingness to be misunderstood. The family's redemption is still unfolding. Some of them are doing the hard, unglamorous work of rebuilding integrity. Others are still too embarrassed to face the woman they mocked. That's real life. Not a tidy ending, but a long, slow reckoning. What Pearl proved is that it's never too late to tell the truth. And it's never too late for those who've been wrong to step into the light and claim their own story. So here's the question I want to leave you with. Who in your life have you underestimated? Which quiet, overlooked person might be holding a secret that would rewrite everything you think you know? And if you were offered the chance to be like Pearl, to give without recognition, to be dismissed without bitterness, to let your impact speak for itself, could you do it? It's a harder question than it sounds. I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Have you ever been the one who was underestimated? Or were you the one who realized too late that you'd overlooked someone remarkable? Share your experience, and let's start a conversation about the hidden generosity all around us. And if this story resonated with you, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next documentary. We're building a community of people who believe that the most extraordinary chapters can happen at any age, in any space, and often in the smallest rooms. Thank you for watching. Until next time, remember, the person you pity today might be the one who holds your tomorrow. Look closer. There is always more than you see.